Although I managed to reach the United States by crossing the Darien jungle, I had to spend months in therapy to overcome, or at least try to cope with, everything I experienced. My traumas surfaced quickly, making it difficult for me to connect with others, even my boss or siblings. It truly felt like hell, and I shared the sentiment of those who said that if God existed, he had abandoned everyone who entered that jungle. We found ourselves halfway through, deep in the heart of the jungle. The group was fairly large, around 50 of us. I heard countless stories of people who were suffering as much as I was in their countries of origin, and others who had endured even worse conditions. Listening to so many horrible experiences left me without the will to complain about my own situation. Some of us tried to hold on to our humanity, but others were rude, ill-mannered, and disrespectful. Our guide, though kind and focused on maintaining order, sometimes lost his patience. He would remind us that his job was simply to guide us, not to prevent us from tearing each other apart. And he wasn't wrong. He endured a lot, especially with people complaining about the pace or begging for breaks, despite knowing the dangers lurking in the jungle. When he refused, people would insult him. Things got worse at sunset. People demanded we stop for the night, but the guide insisted we press on. That's how we arrived at the night that changed everything. A night that left a mark on all who survived. Exhausted, we fell into an uneasy sleep. The discomfort, coupled with the swarms of mosquitoes, made rest nearly impossible. In the dead of night, armed men suddenly appeared, wielding guns, knives, and machetes. They surrounded our group, and even our guide seemed unsure of what was happening. They herded us like cattle into the center and forced us to kneel. Those who dared to resist were beaten into submission, making it clear that pleading was useless. A young boy, flanked by 5 men, emerged from the shadows. He wore jewelry around his neck and hands, but his clothes were torn and filthy. Walking among us, he studied us as if we were specimens. He eventually chose a woman from the group, and the men dragged her away. One of them carved a strange symbol into a nearby tree using a knife. What happened next is something I can barely bring myself to describe. They killed her in such a brutal, horrifying way that her screams echoed through the jungle until they were abruptly silenced. No one moved. No one acted. We were all frozen in fear, watching helplessly. Then the boy chose another victim, and it became clear that this could go on all night, with no regard for our lives. At some point, the men in the group decided to fight back. They stood and attacked our captors, breaking the silence with gunfire, screams of pain, and chaos. I ran and hid behind a tree, witnessing the brutality unfold. These were good people just trying to defend themselves. Then I felt a hand grab my leg. One of the attackers was dragging me into the jungle, his intentions unknown. That's when my brother appeared, striking the man repeatedly with a rock until he killed him. My brother stood frozen, horrified by what he had done, but there was no time to process it. The guide had managed to escape and signaled to us from another location. A small group of 10 joined him, and we fled, leaving the others behind. As we ran, the screams of those left behind echoed in the distance. We didn't dare look back. I can't say that reaching the United States was worth it. Too many lives were lost along the way, and others were taken while trying to defend themselves from those horrific people. I ran away in fear, like a coward, and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. I want to share the story of when I crossed into the United States through the Mexican desert. I was in a desperate situation, and that's what led me to make the decision to leave my home country. However, I wasn't prepared for the traumatic experience of witnessing paranormal activity in the middle of the night during the journey. We were walking under a scorching sun, hotter than anything I had ever felt in my life. The heat was unbearable, and the sand inside my shoes made it feel as though my body weighed twice as much. To make matters worse, the behavior of the coyotes, as the people who guide migrants through the desert are called, didn't help. They constantly reminded us that they wouldn't assist anyone who lagged behind, as it would slow down the rest of the group. They were ruthless and blunt, saying that once we had paid them, it wasn't their concern if someone got lost or didn't make it. While their attitude was harsh, it became clear that they needed a certain level of emotional detachment to handle such situations. Despite their demeanor, they kept track of everyone regularly, ensured we stayed hydrated, and gave instructions on when to rest or slow our pace. It was an exhausting journey, but I held on to the hope that it would all be worth it in the end. Everything changed one night under a full moon. A woman in our group had been asking incessantly how many days were left until we reached our destination. One of the coyotes, clearly annoyed, told her it would take another 10 to 15 days. She grew increasingly anxious, muttering about promises she had made to someone she didn't name. Most of us ignored her, but something about her unease caught my attention. That night I couldn't sleep and decided to keep an eye on her. At one point I saw her stand up and remain motionless, staring at the group as we slept. A strange icy breeze brushed against my face, though the sand didn't stir. I felt a chill run down my spine and instinctively moved away from her. She then approached an older man in the group who was fast asleep and grabbed him by the neck. I wanted to scream but was paralyzed by the shock of what I was witnessing. Before I could act, she pushed me with such force that I tumbled down a small dune. Dazed and disoriented from the fall, I took a moment to climb back up, only to find the man lifeless on the ground. Her appearance had changed drastically. Her skin was grayish, with veins visibly bulging in a bluish hue across her arms, legs, and face. Her eyes glowed with a terrifying mix of red and yellow, and her cracked lips seemed parched beyond belief. She was foaming at the mouth, and her gaze was filled with pure hatred. Chaos erupted when the group woke up to her chilling screams. One of the coyotes, unaware of the situation, told her to calm down and go back to sleep. A young man tried to approach her, placing a hand on her shoulder in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. Without warning, she struck him with such force that he was knocked to the ground, unconscious. The woman's strength was inhuman. She turned her rage toward another member of the group, a mother who had been talking about reuniting with her son in the United States. In a horrifying moment, she attacked the woman, tearing at her face with her nails, leaving deep bloody wounds. While some of us froze in terror, one of the coyotes managed to draw his gun and shot her multiple times, finally bringing her down. The rest of us gathered around to confirm that she was no longer a threat. That night, 3 people lost their lives in a way none of us could have anticipated. Shaken but determined, we resumed our journey, leaving behind the bodies and carrying the fear that such an incident could happen again. Thankfully, it didn't, and we eventually made it to our destination. To this day, I don't know who or what the woman had made promises to, but failing to keep them unleashed, something sinister. It's an experience that will haunt me for the rest of my life. When I made the decision to migrate to the United States, I mentally prepared myself to face the dangers people warned me about. However, I could never have imagined the sinister and supernatural events I would encounter. I experienced pure, unrelenting terror, and after what happened, I swore never to attempt migration again. A friend introduced me to the idea of traveling to the US. By paying a significant amount to a group who promised to smuggle us in the back of a cargo truck, they covered the truck bed with crates of fruit to avoid detection at checkpoints. Before we departed, they assured us it was just a precaution, as the driver was supposedly paying bribes to the authorities to ensure safe passage. Initially, everything went smoothly. Each checkpoint seemed to go exactly as planned. I was traveling with the same friend who had suggested the trip, and he confided how desperate his situation was back home. He had taken out a loan to afford the journey, just like I had, although I had the additional help of my family pooling their resources to support me. We both dreamed of a better life, imagining the United States as it was portrayed in movies, a land of prosperity where we could finally earn a decent living. Yet I couldn't help but worry. I didn't even speak English. When I mentioned this, an older man in the truck reassured me, laughing, that he knew many people in the US who couldn't even speak proper Spanish and were doing fine. The atmosphere in the truck was light-hearted, until a quiet woman who had barely spoken a word during the trip broke her silence. She revealed that she had overheard the driver on the phone saying we weren't being taken to our intended destination. Her trembling voice and erratic behavior caused unease among the group. While some debated her warning, others suggested she was paranoid or making things up. Despite my initial doubt, her words gnawed at me. But the significant investment we had all made pushed me to dismiss her claims. At one point, as the truck slowed down due to rough terrain, the woman suddenly leapt from the vehicle. Those of us near the back looked out to see if she was okay. She had survived the fall and motioned for us to jump too. None of us followed. We pulled the tarp back over the truck bed, trying to sleep and hoping for the best. Hours later, still in the dead of night, we were shaken awake. The truck had stopped and we were ordered out. Outside, we found ourselves standing before a lavish estate in the middle of nowhere. Armed men surrounded us, their rifles pointed directly at us. Confused and terrified, we were herded toward the back of the mansion in a single file like livestock. Behind the estate was a gruesome scene. A large wooden cross stood planted in the ground, with a lifeless, bloodied man hanging from it. His body bore numerous wounds, and the ground beneath him was marked with ominous symbols drawn in blood. Figures in black robes appeared, two of them holding long knives. Someone in our group tried asking what was happening, but we were met with silence. The horrifying realization struck me: this could be our fate. A friend of mine gestured to the dense forest surrounding us, signaling his intent to make a run for it. It was dark, and we believed the night could provide cover. Others noticed our plan and bolted first, triggering chaos. Gunfire erupted as the armed men shot at those fleeing. Some were killed instantly, while others were wounded and fell to the ground. Amid the confusion, I managed to slip away with a young woman. We ran deep into the trees, not stopping for what felt like an hour. When we finally paused, gasping for breath, we knew we couldn't stop for long. Fear drove us forward until we reached a road. There we flagged down a passing vehicle and were taken to the authorities, who deported us back to Mexico. Back in my home country, I contacted a relative for help and returned to my family. To this day, I can't forget the horror of that night. We never reported the incident. We had no idea where that mansion was located, and fear of retaliation kept us silent. Every day, I thank God for saving my life, and my faith has become my greatest source of strength. Many people talk about the Darien jungle, but only those who have crossed it can truly confirm that it's a hell far worse than anything described in the Bible. Fear never leaves your body. You walk almost mechanically, driven by the fear of being left behind, getting lost, or abandoned. It's because I lived through that horrifying experience that I write these words, to share what it was like to pass through that dreadful place. The situation in Venezuela was critical. Eating 3 meals a day had become a thing of the past, and even 2 meals felt like a miracle. My family and I lost an incredible amount of weight, and hunger became a constant reality. Everyone said they couldn't endure another day. Then came the proposal, a journey to the United States through the Darien jungle. Without hesitation, I accepted, with my family's reluctant blessing. As the trek began, some men assured us it was like an intense hike, more exhausting and grueling, but worth it in the end. I clung to those thoughts as long as I could, but not for long. The exhaustion was unbearable. My legs trembled with every step, and nightfall felt agonizingly far away. Mosquitoes were relentless, as was the stress of hearing the guide constantly warning us to stay together. He made it clear he wouldn't return for anyone left behind, urging those lagging to catch up with the group. I was stunned to see pregnant women, teenagers carrying babies, and elderly men and women struggling to walk for even an hour straight. It was madness, day after day of climbing rocks, hills, and mountains. It was sobering to realize I wasn't alone in fleeing a desperate situation. So many others from various places were enduring this nightmare too. Nights were the worst. On one hand, I longed for rest, but the screams in the distance were haunting. Women begged for mercy, pleaded to be left alone, or even asked to be killed. Worse things happened that I won't mention. Things no woman should ever endure. I wasn't the only one who heard it. The fear and despair were palpable in our group. Sometimes we could hear footsteps among the trees, signaling a wild animal nearby. Thankfully, they always seemed to move away. But fear clung to us, never letting go. I barely slept and tried to do so before the cries of the night started. Gradually, we realized people were missing, mostly women. One elderly lady confided that she had seen men with weapons take a woman during the night. They had covered her mouth and carried her away while she screamed minutes later in the distance. I was furious and asked why she hadn't told us. She replied that the men were armed, and it was clear they wouldn't hesitate to kill. I realized she made the right decision. If anyone had acted impulsively, more lives could have been lost. The following days were even worse. We encountered people lying on the ground along the trail, extending their hands for help, asking for food or water, begging not to be left behind. Most were elderly, unable to handle the harsh journey. Ahead we saw bodies, decayed, emitting a stench so foul we covered our mouths as we passed. The guide warned us to hurry, as those corpses could attract scavengers that might turn on us. One day we faced a predator, possibly a jaguar or leopard, though I couldn't tell. We heard it approaching through the trees. The guide urged us not to run, but panic overtook the group. People bolted in different directions, some into the jungle, while others tried to stick to the path. The animal attacked those closest to it, their screams filling the air. I glanced back once and saw enough to push myself to run faster, ignoring who was left behind. At least 30 people were lost that day, and several were killed. Many who ran into the jungle disappeared. I don't know if they found another group, stayed on the right path, or fell victim to the criminals lurking in the jungle. Despite everything, I reached the United States. But every time someone asks me about the journey through the Darien jungle, I make it clear that it's a terrible idea. Even knowing I survived and made it, I would never do it again if I could go back in time. And those were today's stories. Did you like any of them? Comment on which one you liked and tell us if you've ever experienced something like this in your life. Don't forget to like, and I hope to see you in the next video, if you have the courage to watch more stories.